The Big Cypress Investigation, a cryptozoologist's account. Dr. Marion Thatcher, independent cryptozoologist. Field report, Skunk Ape of South Florida. Collier and Monroe Counties, Florida. January 2026. Prologue, the Myakka letter. The letter arrived at the Sarasota Sheriff's Department on December 22, 2000, postmarked from Sarasota but with no return address. Inside were 2 Polaroid photographs and a handwritten note from an anonymous elderly woman who claimed something had been raiding her backyard for 3 nights. The photographs showed a large, dark, ape-like creature partially obscured by palm fronds. In one image, its face was visible, a leathery, wrinkled visage with deep-set eyes and what appeared to be prominent canine teeth. The creature looked directly at the camera with an expression that seemed almost human in its wariness. The woman's letter explained that she'd lured the creature close with apples, then photographed it from her back porch. She described a terrible smell, like garbage and rotten eggs mixed together. After the 3rd night, the creature stopped coming. She never reported seeing it again. The photographs became known as the Myakka skunk ape photos, and they remain some of the most compelling cryptid evidence ever produced. They're also the reason I'm now driving through the humid January heat toward the Big Cypress National Preserve, 3 months after concluding my investigation in South Carolina. Day 1, arrival in South Florida. The landscape changes as you drive south through Florida. The generic American sprawl of Orlando and Tampa gradually gives way to something more primal. Vast stretches of sawgrass prairie, dark swamps, and the peculiar sense that civilization here is temporary, tolerated by the land but not welcomed. I arrived in Ochopee, Florida on a Tuesday afternoon. Ochopee isn't much, a general store, the smallest post office in the United States, and a scattering of houses along the Tamiami Trail. But it sits at the edge of Big Cypress National Preserve, 729,000 acres of swamp, marsh, and hammock that represents some of the wildest terrain left in Florida. This is skunk ape country. I'd rented a small cabin outside Everglades City, a fishing village on the edge of the 10,000 islands. The woman who managed the rental, whose name was Gloria, sized me up with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of outsiders come and go. "You're here about the skunk ape," she said flatly. I was getting used to this. I'm a cryptozoologist. I study reports of unknown animals. Aha. Well, you won't have to look far. Half the people around here have a story. The other half think the first half are full of shit. She handed me the keys. Cabin's got AC, but it struggles when it's really hot. Keep your food inside or the raccoons will get it. And if you smell something awful, like really awful, don't go investigating in the dark. Is that general advice or specific to the skunk ape? She smiled. Around here, there's not much difference. The cabin was basic but clean. 1 room with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a screened porch that overlooked a canal thick with mangroves. I unpacked my equipment and spent the evening reviewing my research materials. The skunk ape has been reported in Florida for decades, possibly centuries. The name comes from the creature's most distinctive characteristic, a powerful, nauseating odor that witnesses consistently describe. Unlike Bigfoot sightings, which span the entire continent, skunk ape reports cluster in southern Florida, particularly in the Everglades and Big Cypress areas. Physical descriptions are remarkably consistent. 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown or black hair, powerfully built, with long arms and a stooped posture. The face is often described as more ape-like than human, with a pronounced brow and large eyes. And always there's the smell. My research had identified several key witnesses I wanted to interview, but I decided to start with the most controversial figure in skunk ape research, Dave Shealy. Day 2, Dave Shealy. Dave Shealy runs a tourist attraction called the Skunk Ape Research Headquarters, located on the Tamiami Trail about 10 miles from my cabin. The building is impossible to miss, painted bright colors with large murals of the skunk ape and signs advertising airboat tours. I'll admit I approached Shealy with skepticism. In cryptozoology, there's always tension between serious researchers and commercial operations that profit from the mystery. But Shealy had been researching the skunk ape for over 30 years, and love him or hate him, he knew the terrain and the stories better than anyone. He met me outside his headquarters, a wiry man in his 50s wearing a skunk ape t-shirt and a baseball cap. His handshake was firm, his manner friendly but wary. "Dr. Thatcher," he said, "got your email. Come on inside, and we can talk." The interior of his headquarters was part museum, part gift shop. There were displays of plaster casts, photographs, maps with sighting locations marked, and shelves of skunk ape merchandise. A small section in back served as Sheely's office and research area. We sat at a table covered with files and photographs. Sheely pulled out a binder and opened it to a map of South Florida, marked with hundreds of colored pins. "MT, you've been researching the skunk ape since the 1990s. What got you started?" "DS, I saw one. 1974, I was 10 years old. My brother and I were out in the swamp, and we saw something walking on two legs through the sawgrass. It was huge, covered in dark hair, and it stank. I mean, you can't imagine the smell unless you've experienced it. Like a dead animal that's been rotting in the sun for a week. My dad was a hunting guide, knew the swamp better than anybody. When we told him what we saw, he said it was probably the skunk ape. He'd heard stories from other hunters, Seminole guides, old-timers who'd been in the Everglades their whole lives. MT, your father believed in it?" "DS, he believed something was out there. Whether it was an unknown ape species or a Bigfoot or something else, he didn't speculate. But he'd seen evidence, tracks, heard the screams, smelled that smell. He took it seriously. MT, you claim to have photographed the skunk ape yourself." "DS 2000. I was out in the Turner River area, and I saw it crossing an open area. I had my video camera and got about 2 minutes of footage before it disappeared into the trees. The video's been analyzed by experts. Some say it's genuine, some say it's a guy in a suit. I know what I saw. MT, the footage has been controversial. DS, everything about this subject is controversial. You could have a live skunk ape in a cage, and people would say it's a hoax. I don't worry about convincing skeptics anymore. I document what I find and let people make up their own minds. MT, tell me about the research you've done, the evidence you've collected." Sheely pulled out several plaster casts of footprints. They were large, 16 to 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and what appeared to be dermal ridges similar to fingerprints. "DS, I've collected dozens of track casts over the years. They're consistent in size and structure. Whatever's making them is heavy. I'd estimate 400 to 600 pounds based on the depth of the impressions. The stride length suggests something with long legs walking bipedally. I've also collected hair samples, had them analyzed by a couple of labs. Results came back as inconclusive. They said the hair was primate-like but didn't match any known species. Could be contaminated samples, could be something else. MT, what about the smell? That seems to be the most consistent element. DS, the smell is real and it's distinctive. It's not just body odor or musk. It's something chemical, almost sulfurous. Some researchers think it might be a defensive secretion like a skunk uses. Others think it's related to diet or habitat. I've smelled it maybe a dozen times over the years, and it's always the same. You don't forget it. MT, have you had any recent sightings or evidence? DS, not personally, but I get reports regularly. He pointed to the map. These pins represent sightings reported to me in the last 5 years. Red pins are visual sightings. Blue pins are tracks or other physical evidence. Yellow pins are smell reports with no visual confirmation. The pattern is clear. The sightings cluster in the Big Cypress and Everglades areas, particularly around the deeper swamps where human activity is minimal. The creature, if it exists, is avoiding populated areas and sticking to the wildest terrain. MT, what do you think it is? Evolutionarily? Ecologically? DS, I think it's a great ape that's managed to avoid classification. Maybe a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, which supposedly went extinct 100,000 years ago. Maybe a species that migrated from Central or South America and adapted to the swamp environment. The Everglades ecosystem could support a population of large omnivores. There's plenty of food, water, and territory. MT, but no bodies have ever been found. No bones, no remains. DS, bodies decompose fast in the swamp. Between the heat, humidity, insects, and scavengers, a carcass can be reduced to nothing in weeks. And if the population is small and the animals are intelligent enough to avoid humans, finding remains would be nearly impossible. Hell, we didn't confirm the Florida panther was still in the state until the 1970s, and that's a known species. We talked for another hour. Sheely showed me his collection of photographs and videos, explained his research methodology, and provided contact information for other witnesses. Whatever my reservations about the commercial aspects of his operation, Sheely was clearly dedicated to the subject. He'd spent decades in the swamp, documented everything he'd found, and maintained detailed records. As I was leaving, he said something that echoed what Marcus Webb had told me in South Carolina. "Dr. Thatcher, the swamp doesn't give up its secrets easily. You want to find the skunk ape, you need to be patient. And you need to be respectful. This is its home. We're just visitors." The Myakka investigation. After meeting with Sheely, I drove to Sarasota to investigate the Myakka photographs. The original photos had been turned over to the sheriff's department, which had conducted a brief investigation before filing them away. The woman who took the photos never came forward, maintaining her anonymity. I'd arranged a meeting with retired Deputy Frank Morrison, who'd been one of the first responders to the letter. He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near downtown Sarasota. Morrison was in his 70s, gray-haired and fit, with the bearing of someone who'd spent a career in law enforcement. He brought a file folder with copies of the original photographs and the letter. "MT. Deputy Morrison, thank you for meeting with me. What do you remember about receiving the Myakka photos?" "FM. It was unusual, to say the least. We get a lot of strange calls and reports, but this was different. The photos were clear, well-focused. And the letter from the woman was very matter-of-fact. She wasn't trying to prove anything or seeking attention. She just wanted to report what had been in her yard." "MT. Did you investigate?" "FM. We tried. The letter didn't have a return address, and the postmark only told us it was mailed from somewhere in Sarasota. We contacted the photo developer. It was a Walgreens, but they processed thousands of photos and couldn't tell us who dropped off that particular roll. We put the photos out to the media, hoping the woman would come forward, but she never did. After a few weeks, the story died down and we moved on to other cases." "MT. What was your impression of the photos? Did you think they were genuine?" "FM. Long pause. I've seen a lot of hoaxes in my career. People dress up, stage photos, try to get attention or money. These photos didn't feel like that. The creature looked real. The texture of the fur, the expression on its face, the way it was positioned. It all looked organic, natural. We had a photo analyst look at them. He said they hadn't been obviously manipulated. No signs of double exposure or digital editing. That didn't mean the subject was real, just that the photos themselves were authentic images of something." "MT. There's been speculation that the creature was an escaped chimpanzee or orangutan." "FM. That was one theory. We contacted zoos and exotic animal facilities in the area. Nobody reported any missing primates. The creature in the photos is also too large to be a chimp. They max out at about 5 feet tall. An orangutan is possible, but the facial structure isn't quite right. And neither species would survive well in Florida's climate long-term." "MT. What's your personal opinion? After all these years?" "FM. I think that woman photographed something unusual. Whether it was an unknown ape species, an escaped exotic animal that had adapted to the area, or something else, I can't say. But I don't think it was a hoax. I think she saw exactly what's in those photos, and it scared her enough that she didn't want her identity known." Morrison let me examine the original letter, preserved in a plastic sleeve. The handwriting was neat, the language educated but informal. The woman described luring the creature with apples for 3 consecutive nights, photographing it on the 2nd and 3rd nights. She noted the smell was so bad I had to go inside between photos to catch my breath. The detail that struck me most was her description of the creature's eyes. They looked sad, like it knew I was taking its picture and didn't want me to. It wasn't aggressive, just seemed tired and hungry. That humanity in her description suggested genuine observation. Hoaxers tend to emphasize the monstrous and frightening. This woman described an animal that seemed as uncertain about the encounter as she was. Day 4. Into Big Cypress. I'd hired a guide named Robert Osceola, a member of the Seminole tribe who worked as a naturalist and hunting guide in the Big Cypress area. His family had lived in South Florida for generations, and if anyone knew the deep swamp, it was Robert. We met at dawn near the entrance to Big Cypress National Preserve. Robert was in his 40s, quiet and economical in his movements, with the calm confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "You're looking for the skunk ape," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm looking for evidence of unusual wildlife in the preserve." He smiled slightly. "My grandfather called it St. Kapkaki. In Seminole, that means tall man." He said it lived in the deepest parts of the swamp, where the water is black and the trees are old. He saw it twice in his life. Said it was taller than any man, covered in dark fur, and moved through the swamp without making sound. "Do you believe in it?" "I've seen its tracks, heard screams at night that don't match any animal I know. And I've smelled it once about 5 years ago in a cypress dome way back in the preserve. That smell. You don't forget it." We drove deep into the preserve on service roads, then continued on foot into areas most visitors never see. The terrain was challenging. Soft muck that sucked at our boots, tangles of sawgrass that cut exposed skin, cypress domes where the water was chest-deep and stained the color of strong tea. Robert moved through it all with practiced ease, reading the landscape like a text. He pointed out animal signs, panther scratches on trees, alligator slides, wading bird rookeries. The ecosystem was thriving, dense with life. Around midday, we reached an area Robert called the Deep Hammock, a raised island of hardwood trees in the middle of the swamp. The ground was relatively dry, and the canopy was thick enough to block most of the sun. It was cooler here, almost pleasant after the brutal heat of the open marsh. "This is the kind of place they use," Robert said quietly. "High ground, fresh water nearby, good visibility in all directions. If I was a large animal trying to avoid humans, this is where I'd be." We found tracks almost immediately. They were in the soft earth near a small pond, clear and fresh, probably made within the last day or two. The prints were enormous, at least 17 inches long and 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes and what appeared to be a prominent heel. The stride pattern suggested bipedal locomotion, each step approximately 4 feet apart. I photographed them from multiple angles, placed a scale reference, and made detailed notes. Then I prepared plaster for casting. While I worked, Robert examined the surrounding area. He found more signs, broken branches at a height of 7 to 8 feet, marks on trees that might have been from something rubbing against them, and a flattened area in the vegetation that could have been a resting spot. "Something big was here," he said. "Recently." As the plaster set, I became aware of a smell. Faint at first, then stronger. It was exactly as witnesses had described. Rotten, sulfurous, almost chemical. Not like an animal's natural musk, but something more pungent and unpleasant. Robert noticed it too. His expression changed, became more alert. "We should go," he said quietly. "The plaster needs another 20 minutes to cure. Then we wait by the water, out in the open." We moved to the edge of the pond, where we had clear sight lines in all directions. The smell persisted, neither growing stronger nor fading. Something was nearby, close enough for us to smell it but not close enough to see. The forest had gone quiet. The constant background noise of birds and insects had faded to silence. In my research, I'd learned that predators create silence. Prey animals freeze and fall quiet when something dangerous is near. We waited. I kept my camera ready, scanning the treeline. Robert stood absolutely still, watching, listening. After 10 minutes, the smell began to fade. Gradually, the forest sounds returned, first tentatively, then with increasing volume. Whatever had been nearby had moved on. We returned to the tracks. The plaster had cured enough to remove. I wrapped the casts carefully and packed them in my bag. As we prepared to leave, Robert examined the ground one more time. "Dr. Thatcher, look at this." He pointed to another track, this one slightly smaller than the others. It was positioned adjacent to one of the larger tracks, the spacing suggesting something had been standing beside the creature that made the first impressions. Two of them, Robert said. An adult and a juvenile, maybe. Or two adults, one smaller than the other. The implication was clear. If there were multiple individuals, that suggested a population, not a solitary creature. It suggested something that was breeding, that had a social structure, that was sustainable in this environment. We hiked back to the vehicle in silence. When we reached the road, Robert said, "My grandfather told me the Estikapkaki were here before the Seminole, before any people. He said they were the original inhabitants of the swamp. He said we should respect them and leave them alone." Do you think that's true? I think the swamp is older than we know. I think there are things living in it that have learned to avoid us. Whether the skunk ape is one of those things, I can't say for certain. But I can tell you this. I've spent my whole life in this swamp, and I don't know everything that lives here. Nobody does. Day 5, the analysis. Back at the cabin, I examined the track casts and photographs. The prints were remarkably clear, showing dermal ridges and fine details that would be difficult to fake. The size and depth of the impressions suggested something massive. I estimated 400 to 500 pounds based on the compression of the soil. I compared them to known primate tracks, gorilla, chimpanzee, orangutan, and found similarities but also distinct differences. The foot structure was more humanoid than ape-like, with a less pronounced big toe and a more developed arch. But the size exceeded any known primate except gorillas, and gorillas don't have foot proportions like these. I also had the audio recording from our time at the hammock. I'd left a recorder running while we worked, and it had captured the period when the smell was present. Analyzing the audio, I found something unusual: low-frequency sounds, below the range of normal human hearing, occurring during the time we smelled the creature. Infrasound, as these low-frequency sounds are called, is produced by some large animals as a form of communication or intimidation. Elephants, tigers, and some apes produce infrasound. The frequencies I recorded were in the 12 to 18 Hz range, which is consistent with large mammal vocalizations. There was also something else on the recording, a pattern of knocking sounds with striking wood, occurring approximately 1 minute before we first noticed the smell. I'd read reports of this phenomenon in Bigfoot research. Witnesses claim the creatures knock on trees, possibly as communication or territorial warning. The evidence was accumulating, but as always, it remained frustratingly ambiguous. I had tracks that could theoretically be faked, though the remote location made that unlikely. I had audio that could be various things. I had the smell, which was real and distinctive but impossible to analyze without a biological sample. What I needed was clearer evidence. A good photograph, a hair sample with analyzable DNA, or, ideally, a direct observation in daylight with multiple witnesses. Day 6. Baron Collier. I'd arranged to interview Baron Collier III, a wildlife biologist who'd worked in the Everglades for 30 years. He agreed to meet me at a restaurant in Naples, where he lived in semi-retirement. Collier was a large man in his 60s with sun-weathered skin and the careful manner of someone who'd spent a career making precise observations. He was skeptical but willing to discuss the skunk ape phenomenon. Mr. Collier, you've spent decades studying Everglades wildlife. Have you ever encountered anything unusual? BC. I've encountered plenty of unusual things. Nature is endlessly surprising. But if you're asking whether I've seen an unknown ape species, the answer is no, I haven't. But you've heard reports from others? BC, many reports. Park rangers, hunting guides, researchers. People whose judgment I trust have told me about encounters that they couldn't explain. Tracks that didn't match known animals. Sounds that weren't in any reference guide. Smells that seemed out of place. What's your professional opinion about these reports? BC. Long pause. As a scientist, I have to acknowledge that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The Everglades ecosystem is vast and largely unexplored. There are areas of deep swamp that humans rarely, if ever, visit. Could a population of large primates exist in that habitat without being definitively documented? Theoretically, yes, but that's a far cry from saying they do exist. The burden of proof is on those making the extraordinary claim. We need physical evidence, a body, bones, clear photographic documentation, DNA that doesn't match any known species. MT, what would it take to convince you? BC, I'd need to see one myself, under clear conditions at close range with enough time to make detailed observations. Or I'd need multiple independent photographs or videos that showed the same type of creature with consistent physical characteristics. Or I'd need biological samples with DNA that could be verified by multiple labs. MT, is the ecosystem capable of supporting a population of large unknown primates? BC, ecologically, yes. The Everglades have abundant food sources: fish, reptiles, birds, small mammals, vegetation. Water is plentiful. There's territory, hundreds of thousands of acres of wilderness. A population of large omnivores could theoretically survive here. The challenge would be population size. You'd need a minimum viable population, probably at least 50 individuals, to avoid inbreeding and maintain genetic diversity. 57-foot-tall apes living in South Florida should leave more evidence than we've found. They should be photographed by trail cameras, observed by the thousands of people who visit the parks, discovered accidentally by hunters or hikers. MT, unless they're actively avoiding humans. BC, that's the argument cryptozoologists make. And it's not impossible. Some animals are remarkably good at avoiding human contact. The Florida panther was thought extinct until the 1970s. But panthers are small, solitary, and extraordinarily elusive. A 7-foot ape is a different matter. MT, have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? BC, hesitates once. About 15 years ago, I was conducting a wildlife survey in a remote area of the Fakahatchee Strand. It was late afternoon, good light. I was alone, maybe 3 miles from the nearest trail. I heard something moving through the swamp, something large. The sound was wrong. Not an alligator, not a bear, not a panther. Whatever it was walking on 2 legs. I could hear the bipedal rhythm, the splash and suck of feet pulling out of muck. I tried to get a visual, but the vegetation was too thick. The movement paralleled my position for maybe 5 minutes, staying about 50 yards away. Then it stopped, and I heard this sound, a low, guttural vocalization that I can only describe as a cross between a growl and a grunt. Then silence. Whatever had been there was gone. MT, you didn't see it? BC, no. And I've spent 15 years trying to convince myself it was a bear or a large wild boar or even a person. But I've worked with all those animals extensively, and what I heard that day didn't match any of them. MT, why didn't you report it? BC, and say what? That I heard something I couldn't identify? In my profession, you need evidence. You need data. Personal anecdote doesn't cut it. Before we parted, Collier gave me a piece of advice. Dr. Thatcher, be careful about confirmation bias. When you're looking for something specific, you tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting your hypothesis. Stay objective. Question everything, including your own observations. That's how good science works. It was sound advice, and I appreciated it. But I couldn't help thinking about what he'd experienced in the Fakahatchee Strand. A wildlife biologist with 30 years of experience, someone who knew every sound and movement pattern in the ecosystem, hearing something he couldn't explain or classify. The historical record. I spent 2 days researching historical accounts of the skunk ape and similar creatures in Florida. The trail went back much further than I'd initially realized. Native American tribes in South Florida, the Seminole, Miccosukee, and earlier inhabitants, had stories of large, hairy forest spirits or wild men. The names varied: Estikapkaki, Yayahas, Shawanoki, but the descriptions were consistent. Tall, strong, covered in hair, dwelling in the deepest parts of the swamp. Spanish explorers in the 16th century made occasional references to hombres salvajes, wild men, seen in the interior regions of Florida, though these accounts are fragmentary and difficult to verify. In the early 20th century, as hunters and trappers penetrated deeper into the Everglades, reports began to surface with more regularity. A 1942 article in the Miami Herald described hunters being frightened by a large ape-like creature in the Big Cypress area. In 1957, A hunting party reported finding enormous tracks in the Fakahatchee Strand that didn't match any known animal. The modern surge of skunk ape reports began in the 1960s and 70s, coinciding with increased human activity in the Everglades. This is a common pattern in cryptozoology. As humans push into previously isolated areas, encounters with rare or unknown species increase. What interested me most was the consistency of the descriptions across decades and across different witness demographics. Hunters, tourists, scientists, park rangers, Seminole guides, all described essentially the same creature with the same distinctive smell. Either there was a remarkably consistent tradition of hoaxing spanning multiple generations, or people were genuinely encountering something unusual. Day 8. Cindy and Clark Thomas. One of the most compelling recent cases involved a couple named Cindy and Clark Thomas, who'd reported a close encounter with the skunk ape in 2018. They'd been visiting Big Cypress on vacation, camping at an established site, when they had an experience that cut their trip short. I met them at their home in Fort Myers. They were in their 50s, both professionals. Cindy was a nurse, Clark was an engineer, and they seemed genuinely reluctant to discuss what had happened. "We don't tell many people about this," Cindy said as we sat in their living room. "People look at you differently when you say you've seen something like that. I appreciate you making an exception. Can you tell me what happened?" We were camping at the Mitchell landing site in Big Cypress. Second night of our trip. We'd had dinner, we're sitting by the fire talking. It was around 9 p.m., full dark. I went to the car to get something, and I smelled it. God, that smell. Like a dumpster that had been sitting in the sun for a week, mixed with sulfur. I thought maybe a skunk had sprayed nearby, but it was wrong. Too strong, too chemical. I called to Clark and he came over. We were both trying to figure out where the smell was coming from when we heard something in the trees behind our tent. Something big, moving deliberately. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the sound, and I saw it. Just for a second, maybe 2 seconds, but I saw it clearly. Describe what you saw. It was tall. 7.5, maybe 8 feet. Dark reddish-brown hair covering its body, matted and muddy. The face was... It looked like a cross between an ape and a human. A heavy brow, deep-set eyes that reflected my flashlight orange. The mouth was slightly open, and I could see teeth. It was standing next to a tree, one hand on the trunk, just watching us. Then it turned and walked away. Not running, just walking, like it wasn't particularly concerned about us. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds. But it felt like forever. We were frozen. When it left, we looked at each other and Clark said, "We're leaving." We packed up right then, in the dark, and drove back to Fort Myers. Did you report it? We called the Park Service the next day. They took a report but were pretty clearly skeptical. They said we'd probably seen a bear. But Clark and I both know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. The thing that sticks with me is how calm it was. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't threatening. It was just there. Like it was as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Then it decided to leave, and it did. The smell, how long did it last? Maybe 10, 15 minutes after the creature left. Then it faded. But that night, even after we got home, I could still smell it in my nose. Like it had saturated everything. Have you been back to Big Cypress? No. And we won't be. I loved camping, loved that area. But after that night, shakes his head. Some places you just don't go back to. The Thomas couple struck me as utterly credible. They had nothing to gain from their story. In fact, they'd avoided publicity and only agreed to speak with me after considerable persuasion. Their description matched the classic skunk ape accounts, and their emotional responses seemed genuine. As I was leaving, Cindy said something that resonated. "Dr. Thatcher, we were trespassing in its home. That's how it felt. Like we were the intruders and it was just reminding us of that fact. I think about it sometimes. What must it be like for these creatures watching humans take over more and more of their territory? Where do they go when there's nowhere left to hide?" Day 9. The night observation. I'd identified a location in the Big Cypress area where multiple sightings had been reported over the years. A cypress dome accessible by a hiking trail but far enough from regular camping areas to be relatively isolated. With Robert Osceola's help, I set up an observation post on the edge of the dome, hidden in the vegetation with a clear view of the water. I brought the same equipment I'd used in South Carolina: night vision scope, motion-activated cameras, audio recorders, and supplies for an overnight stay. Robert helped me set up, then left. He'd offered to stay, but I wanted to minimize human presence and scent. I settled in around 7 p.m. and waited for darkness. The transition from day to night in the swamp is dramatic. The bird sounds fade, replaced by frogs and crickets. Alligators begin their nightly hunting patrols. The temperature drops slightly, and the humidity seems to intensify. Through my night vision scope, I watched the cypress dome. It was eerily beautiful. The strange, swollen bases of the cypress trees rising from black water, the Spanish moss hanging like gray curtains, the occasional splash of a fish or alligator. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first unusual sound. A woodknock, sharp and deliberate, coming from deep within the dome. I activated all my recording equipment and watched. 5 minutes later, another knock, this time closer. Then a third, from a different direction. Something was moving through the cypress dome, and it was announcing its presence. The frogs fell silent. I scanned with my night vision scope, looking for movement. First, I saw nothing unusual. Then, at the far edge of the dome, perhaps 70 yards away, I saw something upright moving between the trees. It was large, moving deliberately through water that appeared to be knee-deep. I adjusted the scope's focus and watched. The figure was massive, powerfully built, covered in what appeared to be dark hair. It moved with a fluid, purposeful gait, not lumbering like a bear, but smooth and controlled. The arms were long, swinging slightly as it walked. Then it stopped. For perhaps 30 seconds, it stood absolutely still, as if listening or watching. I barely breathed, afraid any sound would alert it to my presence. Even 70 yards away, hidden in vegetation, I felt exposed. Turned slightly and I got a better view of its profile. The head was large, set low on massive shoulders with very little visible neck. The face was too shadowed to see clearly through the scope, but the overall silhouette was unmistakably primate, yet different from any ape I'd seen in zoos or documentaries. Then the smell hit me. Even at 70 yards, even with a slight breeze blowing perpendicular to us, I could smell it. That distinctive, nauseating odor that every witness had described. It was like nothing in nature, rotten and chemical and overwhelming. The creature moved again, this time angling away from my position, deeper into the cypress dome. I watched it disappear into the shadows, the green-tinted image of my night vision scope rendering it ghostly and unreal. I checked my cameras immediately. 2 of them had been triggered, recording the movement. The audio recorders had been running continuously. I documented something, though the quality and clarity remained to be seen. The smell lingered for another 20 minutes, gradually fading. The frogs remained silent for almost an hour. When they finally began calling again, it was hesitant, as if testing whether it was safe. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hyper-alertness, but nothing else occurred. As dawn broke and the swamp came alive with morning sounds, I carefully packed my equipment and hiked back to my vehicle. My hands were shaking, whether from excitement, fear, or fatigue, I couldn't say. Day 10, the footage. Back at the cabin, I immediately began reviewing the night's recordings. The motion-activated cameras had captured several seconds of footage showing a large, dark figure moving through the cypress dome. The distance and low light made detailed analysis difficult, but the size and bipedal movement were clear. I ran the footage through enhancement software, improving contrast and sharpness. What emerged was striking. A creature that appeared to be 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, moving through knee-deep water with a smooth, purposeful gait. The proportions were unusual. Very broad shoulders, long arms, a head that seemed to sit directly on the shoulders with minimal neck. I compared the footage to videos of bears walking on 2 legs. Bears do occasionally walk bipedally, but the movement pattern is different, more lumbering and unstable. This creature moved with the confidence and balance of something that regularly walked upright. I also compared it to videos of known great apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees. There were similarities in the overall body structure and movement, but also differences. The creature in my footage was taller than any known ape except gorillas, but moved more fluidly than gorillas typically do in bipedal locomotion. The audio recordings were equally interesting. I'd captured the woodknock sounds, 3 distinct impacts, each lasting less than a second, with a frequency pattern consistent with hardwood striking hardwood. I'd also captured low-frequency vocalizations during the time the creature was visible, sounds in the 15 to 20 Hz range that were at the edge of human hearing. Most significantly, I'd captured the sound of movement through water. The rhythm was distinctly bipedal, splash, pause, with a stride pattern that suggested something with long legs taking deliberate steps. But the question remained, was this enough? I had footage showing something large and upright moving through a swamp at night. I had audio of unusual sounds. I had my own observation through a night vision scope and the experience of smelling that distinctive odor. Yet I didn't have a clear photograph of the creature's face. I didn't have biological samples. I didn't have multiple witnesses to corroborate my observations. In short, I had what every cryptozoologist has, compelling but not conclusive evidence. Day 11. Dr. Jane Pemberton. I needed professional analysis of my footage and audio. I contacted Dr. Jane Pemberton, a primatologist at Florida State University who specialized in great ape behavior and locomotion. I'd worked with her briefly on a previous research project, and I knew she'd give me an honest, scientifically rigorous assessment. We met at her office in Tallahassee. I'd driven up that morning with my laptop and backup drives containing all my recordings. Dr. Pemberton was in her 40s, with short gray hair and the direct manner of someone who didn't suffer nonsense. I showed her the footage without preamble or explanation of what I thought it showed. She watched it 3 times, then asked to see it in slow motion. We spent the next hour analyzing every frame. JP, Dr. Thatcher, where was this filmed? MT Big Cypress National Preserve. The subject was approximately 70 yards from my position, moving through shallow water in a cypress dome. JP, and you filmed this when? MT 3 nights ago, around 10:15 p.m. She replayed the footage again, this time with measurement tools overlaid on the screen. She calculated the creature's height based on the water depth and nearby vegetation. She analyzed the stride length and cadence. She examined the arm swing and posture. JP, the proportions are unusual. If this is a person, they're very tall, 7.5 feet minimum, probably closer to 8. The shoulder width is exceptional, suggesting either substantial musculature or a naturally broad frame. The arm length is notable, longer than typical human proportions but not quite as long as gorilla proportions. MT. Could it be a person in a costume? JP, it's possible. Doesn't quite reach that threshold. She analyzed the audio recordings next, particularly the low-frequency vocalizations. She compared them to recordings of known great apes and found similarities but also differences. The frequencies were lower than typical chimpanzee vocalizations, higher than gorilla vocalizations, and the pattern didn't match orangutan communication. JP, these could be infrasound communications which are used by several large mammal species. The pattern suggests intentional vocalization rather than ambient noise. But again, without additional context or recordings, I can't say definitively what produced these sounds. Before I left, Dr. Pemberton offered some advice. Dr. Thatcher, if you're going to pursue this seriously, you need better equipment and better conditions. Night vision is useful, but you need high-resolution cameras with sufficient light. You need multiple observation points to rule out hoaxing. And ideally, you need other researchers present to provide independent verification. One person's observations, no matter how careful, won't convince the scientific community. She was right, of course, but her analysis had confirmed that my footage showed something unusual, something that defied easy explanation. That was progress, even if it wasn't proof. The historical photograph investigation. I returned to Sarasota to investigate the Mayaka photographs more thoroughly. I'd obtained permission to examine the original Polaroids, which were stored in the sheriff's department's evidence archive. The photos were in surprisingly good condition, protected in acid-free sleeves. I examined them under magnification, looking for signs of manipulation or artificiality. The images showed a creature partially obscured by palm fronds, its face visible in one photo, its body more prominent in the other. The details were remarkable. Individual hairs were visible in the fur, showing different lengths and colors, dark brown to reddish brown, exactly as witnesses described. The face showed wrinkles and texture that would be difficult to replicate in a costume. The eyes had depth and reflection consistent with real eyes, not glass or plastic. Most tellingly, the photographs showed the creature in two different positions, suggesting movement between shots. In the first photo, it was reaching toward the ground, possibly picking up apples. In the second, it was more upright, facing the camera directly. The consistency of lighting and background confirmed these were taken from the same position on consecutive nights. I'd also tracked down the Walgreens where the photos had been developed. The manager, who'd worked there since the 1990s, remembered the incident. "We got visited by reporters and police after those photos made the news," he told me. "Everyone wanted to know who'd dropped off the film, but we processed hundreds of rolls a day back then. There was no way to track down one specific customer, especially if they paid cash." "Do you remember any unusual customers around that time? Anyone who seemed nervous or secretive?" "Not specifically, but I'll tell you what I do remember. When we saw those photos come off the developer, we all stopped and stared. Nobody said, 'That's obviously fake,' or 'That's just a costume.' We all just looked at each other like, 'What the hell is that?'" The authenticity of the woman who took the photos seemed increasingly credible. She'd used a simple Polaroid camera, submitted the photos anonymously, and never sought publicity or profit. Her letter was matter-of-fact and practical. She described luring the creature with apples, photographing it, and being relieved when it stopped coming. This was the behavior of someone documenting a genuine experience, not someone perpetrating a hoax. Day 13. The Seminole Council. Robert Osceola arranged for me to meet with several elders from the Seminole tribe, who agreed to discuss their traditional knowledge of the Esti-Kapkaki. We met at the Big Cypress Seminole Reservation, in a meeting room decorated with traditional artwork and historical photographs. 3 elders were present: William Cypress, Mary Billy, and Frank Shore. All were in their 70s or 80s, and all had grown up in the Big Cypress area before modern development. They were cautious at first, uncertain about sharing traditional knowledge with an outsider. But Robert vouched for my intentions, and they agreed to speak with me. WC. The Esti-Kapkaki has been part of our stories for as long as anyone remembers. My great-grandfather spoke of them, his grandfather spoke of them. They are older than the Seminole presence in Florida. MT. What do your traditions say about them? What are they? MB. They are the swamp people. They live in the deepest places, where the water is black and the trees are ancient. They are shy, avoiding humans when possible. But they are also curious about us. FS. My grandfather saw one when he was a young man in the 1920s. He was hunting in the Fakahatchee Strand, and he encountered one at dusk. He said it was taller than any man, covered in dark red hair, with eyes that caught the light. They watched each other for a long moment. Then the Esti-Kapkaki turned and walked into the swamp. MT. Did your grandfather feel threatened? S. No. He said he felt like he was being evaluated. The creature was deciding whether he was a danger. When it determined he wasn't, it simply left. MB. This is their nature. They are not aggressive unless provoked. They want to be left alone to live their lives in peace. It is we who intrude on their territory. WC. The smell, this is a defense. When they feel threatened or when they want to drive humans away, they release this scent. It is powerful, overwhelming. We have learned to respect it. When you smell that smell, you leave the area. MT. Are they intelligent? MB. Yes. Very intelligent. They know the swamp better than any human. They know which plants to eat, where the water is good, how to avoid the alligators and snakes. They have their own language, the wood knocking, the calls, the howls. They communicate with each other across long distances. FS. My daughter, who is a biologist, she says there cannot be apes in Florida. She says science would have found them, documented them. But I tell her, the swamp does not reveal everything. There are places humans never go, areas too remote, too dangerous. The Esti Kapkaki know these places. They have lived there for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands. MT, what do you think they are? Evolutionarily, WC, we do not think of them that way. They are the swamp people. They are part of the natural world, like the panther and the alligator. They have always been here, and they will remain here as long as the swamp remains. The elders shared several other accounts passed down through generations, sightings, tracks, encounters that had shaped seminal understanding of the creatures. They spoke with the confidence of people describing something real and known, not legendary or mythical. Before we concluded, Mary Billy said something that stayed with me. Dr. Thatcher, you come here with your cameras and recorders, trying to prove they exist. But for us, there is nothing to prove. They exist. We know they exist. The question is not whether they are real, but whether they will survive as humans take more and more of their land. That is what concerns us. Day 15. Return to the hammock. I returned to the deep hammock where Robert and I had found tracks the previous week. This time, I came prepared with additional equipment, high-resolution cameras, better audio recording gear, and trail cameras to leave in the area for extended monitoring. Robert guided me again, though he was less enthusiastic about returning to a location where we'd encountered the smell. The Esti Kapkaki does not like to be studied, he warned. You push too hard, go too often, you may provoke a response. Not violent, but unwelcoming. I'll be respectful. I just want to document the area more thoroughly. We reached the hammock around mid-morning. The tracks we'd found on our first visit had been washed away by rain, but I found new signs. More scratches on trees, broken branches, a flattened area in the vegetation that could have been a resting spot. I set up trail cameras in multiple locations, positioning them to cover game trails and water sources. These were high-quality cameras with motion sensors and infrared capability, capable of taking photos day or night. If anything moved through this area, the cameras would capture it. While I worked, Robert explored the surrounding area. He found something that made him call me over. A tree that had been stripped of bark in a vertical line, approximately 7 feet high. The bark had been removed recently, the wood underneath still fresh. Bears do this, I said. They mark territory by scratching and stripping bark. Bears do, Robert agreed. But bears don't reach 7 feet high. And look at the pattern, this was pulled off in strips, deliberately. Not clawed or torn, but peeled. He was right. The pattern suggested hands, not claws. Something with opposable thumbs or at least significant manual dexterity had removed the bark. We found similar markings on 3 other trees in the area, all at approximately the same height. The pattern suggested territorial marking, a way for the creature to establish its presence and warn others away. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something else. A depression in the ground near the pond, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The vegetation inside the depression was flattened, and there was a smell, faint but present, of that distinctive skunk ape odor. This could be a resting spot, I said. Maybe even a regular sleeping area. Robert nodded but looked uncomfortable. We should go. We've been here too long. As we hiked back toward the vehicle, I heard it. A distant call that sounded almost like a howl or scream, echoing through the swamp. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then cut off abruptly. Robert stopped walking. That was them. That was a warning. Warning about what? We've overstayed our welcome. We didn't run, but we walked quickly. Behind us, I heard another call, closer this time. Then would knocks, 3 sharp impacts in rapid succession. We reached the vehicle without further incident, but the message had been clear. Something had been aware of our presence, had tolerated it to a point, but was now communicating that we should leave. Day 16. Dr. Thomas Hendricks. I needed another expert opinion, someone who could provide perspective on whether the behavior I was documenting was consistent with known primate species. I contacted Dr. Thomas Hendricks, a primatologist at Emory University who specialized in great ape communication and social behavior. We spoke by video conference, and I shared my recordings of the wood knocks, vocalizations, and the territorial markings I'd found. Dr. Hendricks listened and watched with the focused attention of someone analyzing data. Dr. Thatcher, the wood-knocking behavior is particularly interesting. Chimpanzees do engage in drumming behavior, striking trees with their hands or feet, sometimes using rocks or sticks. Gorillas engage in chest beating, which serves a similar function. Both behaviors are primarily communicative, used to establish territory, attract mates, or warn off rivals. The pattern I recorded, 3 sharp knocks in succession. Does that match known ape behavior? It's consistent with communicative drumming. Chimpanzees often use patterns, repeated strikes in specific rhythms. The 3-knock pattern could be a territorial announcement or a location call to group members. What about the territorial markings? The bark stripping at significant height? Bears are the most common explanation for bark stripping in North American forests. But gorillas also engage in tree-marking behavior, particularly dominant males. They'll scratch bark, break branches, and strip vegetation as a way of establishing their presence. The height you're describing, 7 feet, is consistent with a large male gorilla standing upright. But gorillas don't exist in Florida. No, they don't. Which brings us to the central question: what are you actually documenting? If these behaviors are genuinely primate in nature, then you're looking at either an escaped or released captive ape that somehow survived in the wild, or something else. What's your assessment of the possibility of an unknown species? From an evolutionary perspective, it's highly unlikely. The great apes evolved in Africa and Asia. There's no fossil evidence of large primates in the Americas except for humans, who arrived relatively recently. For a population of unknown apes to exist in Florida, they would have had to either cross the Bering Strait during an ice age or be introduced by humans. Neither scenario has any supporting evidence. But theoretically, could a population of large primates survive in the Everglades ecosystem? Theoretically, yes. The habitat could support them, plenty of food, water, territory. The challenge would be avoiding detection. In an age of satellite imagery, trail cameras, and millions of tourists visiting the parks every year, it's hard to imagine a population of 8-foot-tall apes remaining completely undocumented. Unless they're extraordinarily adept at avoiding humans. That would require intelligence comparable to or exceeding human intelligence. They'd need to understand cameras, recognize human presence from a distance, avoid areas of human activity, and pass this knowledge to their offspring. Is that possible? In theory, yes. Apes are highly intelligent. But it would represent a level of cultural transmission and strategic thinking that we rarely see even in the most cognitively advanced primates. Dr. Hendricks' assessment was balanced. He didn't dismiss my evidence, but he also didn't accept it as proof of an unknown species. He suggested several additional research approaches, including genetic analysis of any biological samples I could collect and long-term camera trap studies in the most remote areas of the swamp. Dr. Thatcher, he said as we concluded, you're doing the right kind of work, systematic, documented, open to multiple interpretations. Keep at it. If there's something unusual in those swamps, persistent, methodical research is how it will be discovered. Day 18. The trail camera results. 2 weeks after placing trail cameras in the deep hammock, I returned with Robert to collect them. I was anxious about the results. Trail cameras had revolutionized wildlife research, capturing animals in their natural behavior without human presence. If something unusual lived in this area, the cameras might have documented it. We approached cautiously, alert for signs of the creatures. The area seemed quiet, normal. The trail cameras were still in place, undisturbed. I collected the memory cards and checked the camera logs. All 6 cameras had been triggered multiple times. Animals moving through the area day and night. I couldn't wait to return to the cabin to review the footage, but I had to. Back at the cabin, I loaded the memory cards onto my laptop and began the tedious process of reviewing thousands of images. Most showed exactly what you'd expect: deer, wild boar, raccoons, alligators, wading birds, and countless false triggers from moving vegetation. But on camera 3, positioned to cover a game trail near the pond, I found something unusual. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., 4 days after I'd installed the cameras. The image showed a large, upright figure moving across the trail. It was dark, the infrared rendering made details difficult, but the shape was unmistakably bipedal and massive. The creature was caught mid-stride, one leg forward, arms swinging naturally. The next frame, triggered 3 seconds later, showed the creature from a different angle as it moved off the trail. This image was clearer. The body was covered in hair, the proportions distinctly non-human. The head was large, sitting low on broad shoulders. One arm was visible, hanging to approximately knee length, much longer than human proportions. I had 6 more images from that sequence showing the creature moving through the area. In the clearest frame, part of its face was visible in profile. A heavy brow, a pronounced jaw, features that looked simian but not quite matching any known ape. I ran the images through every analysis tool I had. Height estimation based on known background objects suggested the creature stood between 7 and 8 feet tall. Body mass estimation based on the depth of its footprints in soft ground, visible in one frame, suggested 400 to 500 pounds. The hair coverage was complete except for the face, palms, and soles of the feet. Then I found the second sequence on camera 5, dated 8 days after installation. This one showed 2 creatures, one large, one significantly smaller. They moved through the frame together, the smaller one staying close to the larger, suggesting a parent-offspring relationship or at least social bonding. The images were grainy, taken at night, and the creatures were partially obscured by vegetation. But they were real. Whatever these trail cameras had captured, it wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume, wasn't a hoax. These were images of something living in the Big Cypress swamp, something unknown to science. Day 19, the decision. I sat in my cabin, staring at the trail camera images on my laptop, facing the decision every cryptozoologist eventually confronts. What do I do with this evidence? I could release it immediately, post it online, send it to news organizations, present it at cryptozoology conferences. It would generate publicity, probably bring other researchers to the area, might even force scientific institutions to take the phenomenon seriously. Or I could be more measured, submit it to peer-reviewed journals, consult with additional experts, build a comprehensive case before making it public. This approach would be more scientifically rigorous but risked the evidence being stolen, leaked, or dismissed before I could properly contextualize it. Or I could do what Marcus Webb had suggested about his video from South Carolina: keep it private, respect the creature's privacy, accept that some mysteries don't need to be solved. I thought about the Seminole elders, who knew the Estes-Kapkaki existed and saw no need to prove it to outsiders. I thought about Mary Billy's concern, not whether these creatures exist, but whether they'll survive as human development encroaches on their territory. If I released clear evidence of the skunk ape's existence, what would happen? Would it lead to scientific protection and conservation efforts? Or would it bring trophy hunters, sensation seekers, and developers who saw opportunity in creating skunk ape tourist attractions? The creatures in my trail camera images were going about their lives, moving through their territory, foraging, raising young. They'd managed to survive in South Florida despite massive human development because they'd remained hidden, mysterious, unproven. Did I have the right to change that? Day 20, Patricia Valdez. I needed to talk to someone who understood both the scientific importance and the ethical implications of what I'd found. I called Dr. Patricia Valdez, the herpetologist from the University of South Carolina who'd analyzed my lizard man evidence. I sent her the trail camera images through a secure, encrypted connection, and we scheduled a video call for that evening. Her reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "Marion, these images are remarkable. Whatever you've captured here, it's not a bear, not a known ape, not anything in the taxonomic record. The proportions are all wrong for any known animal. So you believe it's real? An unknown species? She was quiet for a long moment. I believe you've captured images of something that requires explanation. Whether that something is a remnant population of Gigantopithecus, a New World ape species that somehow escaped fossil documentation, or something else entirely, I can't say. But these images are scientifically significant. The question is what I do with them. That's not a scientific question, Marion. That's an ethical one. And it's one I can't answer for you. We talked for over an hour about the implications. If the skunk ape was real and I could prove it, it would be one of the most significant zoological discoveries of the century. But it would also make these creatures vulnerable in ways they'd never been before. There's a concept in conservation biology, Dr. Valdez said, the extinction vortex. Once a species is threatened, documented, and publicized, it becomes vulnerable to multiple pressures: habitat loss, poaching, collection for zoos or research, even well-meaning but disruptive conservation efforts. Sometimes the best protection for a rare species is obscurity. So you're saying I should suppress this evidence? I'm saying you should think carefully about the consequences of releasing it. These creatures, if they exist, have survived because they're unknown. Once they're known, everything changes. Day 22. The final expedition. I decided on one more expedition into the deep swamp before making my decision. I wanted to see the area again, to spend time in the creature's territory, to understand what I might be exposing to the world. Robert Osceola agreed to guide me, though he was increasingly uncomfortable with my continued presence in the area. The Esticapkaki have been patient with you, he said as we prepared to enter the swamp. But patience has limits. They've shown themselves to your cameras because they didn't know the cameras were there. Now they know. They won't be so careless again. How do they know? They're intelligent. They watch, they learn. They've seen you placing cameras, seen you collecting them. They understand what you're doing. We entered the swamp at dawn, moving slowly through the familiar terrain. The deep hammock was quiet when we arrived, too quiet. The normal sounds of wildlife were muted, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. I checked the trail cameras I'd left in place. 2 of them had been moved, not destroyed or damaged, but carefully relocated so they pointed at the sky or at trees rather than at the trails. The cameras were still functional, still recording, but they'd been rendered useless. They moved them, I said. Robert nodded. I told you. They know. We found other signs of intelligence. Sticks arranged in patterns near my camera locations, piles of stones that hadn't been there before, fresh territorial markings on trees directly in front of where cameras had been positioned. The creatures were sending a message. We see you, we know what you're doing, and we don't consent. As we prepared to leave, I heard it. A loud, clear howl from somewhere deep in the Cypress Dome. It was answered by another howl from a different direction, then a third from behind us. We were surrounded by calls, the creatures communicating with each other about our presence. Time to go, Robert said quietly. We hiked back to the vehicle quickly but without panic. The calls continued, tracking our movement, ensuring we left their territory. We weren't being threatened, but we were definitely being escorted out. When we reached the vehicle, Robert turned to me. Dr. Thatcher, you have your evidence. You have your photographs. Now you must decide, do you respect their privacy, or do you expose them to the world? Conclusions. After 4 weeks in South Florida, I'm left with more certainty than I had in South Carolina, but also more ethical complications. The evidence for the skunk ape's existence is substantial and compelling. Multiple credible witnesses spanning decades, with consistent descriptions of appearance, behavior, and that distinctive smell. Physical evidence including tracks with dermal ridges, territorial markings at significant heights, and behavioral patterns consistent with intelligent, socially organized primates. Trail camera photographs showing large, bipedal, hair-covered creatures that don't match any known animal species. Audio recordings of vocalizations and communication patterns consistent with primate behavior but not matching any cataloged species. Traditional knowledge from the Seminole tribe documenting these creatures' presence for generations. Unlike the lizard man investigation, where evidence remained tantalizingly ambiguous, the skunk ape evidence is more substantial. I believe I've documented an unknown species of great ape living in the swamps of South Florida. This belief is based not on faith or wishful thinking, but on careful observation, systematic documentation, and analysis by qualified experts. But what do I do with this belief, with this evidence? The creatures I've documented have survived because they've remained hidden. They've adapted to an environment where humans are increasingly present by being more elusive, more careful, more intelligent about avoiding detection. They've developed strategies, nocturnal activity, use of remote areas, possibly even understanding of cameras and human technology, that have kept them out of the scientific record. If I release my evidence, that changes. These creatures will become subjects of study, targets of tourism, objects of curiosity. The deep swamp where they live will be invaded by researchers, photographers, hunters, and sensation seekers. The creatures will be forced to adapt again, to retreat further, possibly to abandon areas they've used for generations. And if the population is small, if these are the last survivors of their species, that pressure could be catastrophic. Epilogue: the choice. I've decided to publish a partial account of my research, this document describing my methods, observations, and conclusions, but without releasing the trail camera photographs. The images remain in my possession, backed up in multiple secure locations, but not shared publicly. This decision will frustrate many. Cryptozoology enthusiasts will accuse me of withholding proof. Scientists will say I'm not providing adequate evidence to support my claims. Skeptics will say I'm perpetuating a hoax by refusing to release the images. They may all be right to some degree, but I keep thinking about what Mary Billy said. The question isn't whether these creatures exist, but whether they'll survive. The skunk ape has lived in South Florida for possibly thousands of years, coexisting with humans by remaining hidden. They've earned their privacy. They've earned the right to live without becoming spectacles or specimens. My research has convinced me they exist. That's enough for me. Whether it's enough for the scientific community or the public is secondary to the welfare of the creatures themselves. I've provided my evidence to select conservation organizations, working behind the scenes to ensure that critical habitat in the Big Cypress and Everglades areas receives protection. I've worked with the Seminole tribe to identify areas where the creatures are most frequently observed, so those areas can be quietly protected. This isn't the dramatic conclusion some might want. No clear photographs released to the world, no scientific naming ceremony, no vindication of cryptozoology as a discipline. But it's the right conclusion. The swamp keeps its secrets, and some secrets should stay kept. 3 months after leaving Florida, I received an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Ochope. Inside was a single photograph, not one of mine, but something new. The image showed the edge of a cypress dome at dawn, golden light filtering through the trees. In the foreground, partially obscured by vegetation, was a large, hair-covered creature. It was sitting, its back to the camera, looking out over the water. The posture was peaceful, contemplative, a being at rest in its own territory. Beside it, smaller and leaning against the larger figure, was a juvenile. The two sat together in the morning light, apparently unaware they were being photographed. Or perhaps they were aware and simply didn't care. Perhaps this was their way of saying, "We're still here, we're surviving, and we trust you to keep our secret." There was no note, no explanation. But I knew who'd sent it: Dave Shealy, Robert Osceola, or perhaps another researcher who'd found my address through the cryptozoological network. Someone who wanted me to see that the creatures were still there, still living their lives, still remaining just beyond definitive proof. I've kept that photograph, too. It sits in my desk drawer, a reminder of what exists in the deep swamp, what persists despite our science and our certainty about what is and isn't possible. The skunk ape is real. I know this with the certainty that comes from systematic observation, documented evidence, and personal experience. But some truths don't need to be proven. Some mysteries are more valuable unsolved. The swamp keeps its secrets, and I intend to help keep them.